speaker today really needs no introduction. He spoke to us several times over the years on subjects from a real vile, wild herb called a ramp to a red-skinned hot dog in Marion, Virginia, to Ernest T. Bass, to Dr. Enough, and the culinary delights of New York City, I believe. And he actually followed his father's path from the beaches of Normandy through Europe and told us about that trip. He's going to talk to us today about Cuban sandwiches. He currently serves as senior writer at ETSU, where he's also an announcer and producer at ETS-FM. He's the host of a new weekly program on WETS called Vital Voices. He's written and edited 7 food-related books. He's produced 8 documentary films. He and his wife Jill, who's a local girl from over in Scott County, I believe, write the flavors column for each issue of the Blue Ridge Country magazine, which is published out of Roanoke, Virginia. He also writes a monthly column for the taste page in both the Kingsport Times News and Johnson City Press. He appears once a month on Food with Fred on WJHL TV. And in his spare time, when he has any, he plays piano and fiddle and is a student at the Root Studio School in Jonesboro, where he studies oil painting. And like I say, today he's here to talk to us about the Cuban sandwich, so please help me give my good friend Fred Sauceman a big
say to you is to echo what has been said about Jeanette Blazer, who fits the definition of grand lady probably better than anybody I've ever met. So congratulations to you. Talking about another Kingsport legend, Ronnie mentioned the radio show I'm doing now. We've lost connection with this. Called Vital Voices. That started last weekend, and I started it with a very special person from right here in Kingsport. Part 2 of that interview will be this weekend. The show airs at 7 o'clock on Saturday morning and at 2 o'clock on Sunday afternoon. And that special person I interviewed by phone was Dr. John Shelton Reed. Many of you will remember him. His father was a doctor here in Kingsport. His grandfather was a doctor who helped start the hospital here. And John, thank you, who went to MIT. Did you know John was an MIT graduate? He was. Went to MIT and then became a social scientist with a PhD from Columbia University. John can talk to you about anything, and that's what we did for an hour and a half on the telephone. And I've cut that into 2 different shows, and I'll do another one later with his favorite subject in mind, which is Southern barbecue. So listen for that program on 89.5, part 2, Saturday at 7 if you're up there early, or Sunday afternoon 2 if you're home from church. They are also on the WETS webpage as podcasts. So one of my favorite people in the world, John Shelton Reed, Jeanette Blazer, people who define what Kingsport really is all about. I'm here today to talk about Cuban sandwiches, and you're thinking, how is this guy going to fill what little time I have with information on the Cuban sandwich? Well, there has been an entire book, probably more than one book, written about the Cuban sandwich. I love Cubans. That bumper sticker means 2 things. I love Cubans as in sandwiches. I love Cubans as in people. I was fortunate in my 1st grade class at Eastview Elementary School in Greenville, Tennessee, one of the best elementary schools in the country then and still today, to have a Cuban refugee in my class. His name was Jose Ramon Balea Serra. And his family, like several others in Greenville, had come to town from Cuba so that their fathers could take jobs at Green Valley Developmental Center. And this is in 1962. Think back to 1961, 1962. This country has had a tumultuous relationship with Cuba, to say the least. In 1961, in April of 1961, you had the Bay of Pigs invasion. Bay of Pigs fiasco, many people say. And about a year, which almost ended John F. Kennedy's presidency. In today's political climate, I don't think his presidency would have survived that fiasco. About a year and a half later, what happens? The Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962, which I think saved Kennedy's presidency in the way he handled that situation. By the way, if you want to read a really good book on the Cuban Missile Crisis, look up 1 Minute to Midnight by Michael Dobbs. It's an almost minute-by-minute account of the world being on the brink of nuclear war and how Kennedy, through his naval blockade and standing up to Khrushchev, stopped that. So, with that in mind, here's a quotation from actually a person who taught for a semester at ETSU. No other Latin American nation has left as pervasive an imprint on this country's cultural landscape as that Long Island in the Caribbean. Yes, an entire book has been written recently about Cuban sandwiches. This was published in 2022 by the University of Florida Press. I would like to think that I had at least an indirect role in giving Tampa, Florida better credit for its role in perpetuating the Cuban sandwich. When I was editing this book in 2009 for publication in 2010 for the University of Georgia, I found in a cigar magazine, of all places, a story titled "Welcome to Cuban Sandwich City" by a man named Andrew Hughes, whose name is on that book. Hughes and his co-writers in that Cuban sandwich book say that obscure article in that cigar magazine, which was picked up by our book, brought Tampa, Florida's case as the home of the Cuban sandwich to national attention. Now, if I were giving this talk in Miami, we would already have a riot here. The Cuban sandwich is one of those things we fight over. Remember, in Southern food culture, we fight about barbecue, probably most vehemently. We fight about how to do chicken and dumplings. We fight about whether we put sugar in cornbread or not. We fight about sorghum versus molasses, and they're two different things. I've told y'all that before. We fight about a lot of things, and by gosh, we fight over this sandwich too. I think it's the most symbolic sandwich in the world. I really do. This is a quotation from the book. For Cuban exiles in the United States, their cuisine became a pillar of identity and resistance against both the revolution and the pressure to fully Americanize. Cuban cuisine, and by extension the sandwich, was to be revered and preserved by the exiles, not trifled with. To me, the Cuban sandwich means so much more than filling a belly. It's a story of adaptation, making do with what you have when you're forced out of your homeland. And keep in mind, that's what happened to thousands and thousands of Cuban people. For political reasons, they had to leave their home and become displaced persons. That's unimaginable to me, to do that. They assimilated, yet they remained independent. They rebelled. The Cuban sandwich is above all about memory and identity, and it's a symbol for that displaced people. Gustav Perez Firmat, in that book that was quoted earlier in the talk, calls Cuban people hyphenated people, Cuban Americans. Their identity is Cuban, their identity is American. People in exile, people who have been forced to leave their home, remember the past most strongly, I think, through food. We have a friend in Jonesboro She was born in Cuba and was forced to leave, and remembers very clearly how much she could take out of Cuba, and it was very little. She took all the cookbooks, all the newspaper recipes, all the magazine recipes she could find, and transcribed her favorite ones into a little notebook that she bought at the Havana, Cuba Woolworths. And she still has that today. The only things she could take out of Cuba were that book, family pictures, and the baptismal robe. That's it. But to go at her home in Jonesboro today and look at that book, which is splattered with olive oil all through it, and to watch her flip through that book and remember these recipes is really heart-wrenching. Her brother-in-law is my strongest tie to Cuban culture. One of my favorite people in all the world. I've probably mentioned his name to you before. His name is Dr. Eduardo Zayas Bazan. He will be 88 years old in a few months. He taught at ETSU for many years, chaired the foreign language department, retired, and eventually moved to Miami to be around more of his own people, which you can certainly understand. But still today, at the age of 87, he comes back to Kingsport and roasts a pig for his family and for his friends. And to me, that is one of the most significant gatherings that happens in this community. I wouldn't miss it. I'm going October 28th. And it means so much to Eduardo. I love that picture of him. It was taken in the barn at Allendale. Late one night, after the pig had been eaten, after the black beans and rice had been eaten, after the ladies had fought over who made the best flan that weekend, there's Eduardo standing there listening to the music, Brim Leal playing guitar, his wife singing, listening to Cuban music and American music. He served me my first Cuban sandwich, and along with it, this snack of guava paste and cream cheese and cracker. This is Eduardo's family. Eduardo, the tall guy in the back. They were wealthy in Cuba, but lost it all. Because, sorry, I keep getting it away. But lost it all because of Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro's regime took their home, took their property, and they had to leave. Eduardo had taken part in the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. He was a good swimmer, so he was recruited by the American CIA as a frogman. He was wounded in the Bay of Pigs. He was shot in the leg, friendly fire, spent a year in prison. The United States ransomed him for $100,000. You talk about patriotism, and we saluted the flag, did the pledge today. You won't find any more patriotic people than those like Eduardo. But that fancy house, those nice clothes, all gone. They had to start completely over. Now, this is what's happening to the Cuban sandwich. I love the Shamrock in Johnson City, Tennessee. It's our oldest food purveyor, opened in 1929, but this is a recent Cuban sandwich in big fat quotation marks from the Shamrock. It's basically a ham sandwich with wheat bread. That is not what a Cuban sandwich is at all. This is one that's very close. It happens to have been done by the folks at Kane Street Smokehouse in Gate City, Virginia, a really good barbecue joint. A barbecue joint that uses no gas, no electricity. There's a wood pile out back the way God intended barbecue to be cooked. They make a Cuban sandwich, and they replace the mojo pork, and I'll talk about mojo pork in a minute, with barbecue smoked pork shoulder. More significantly than that is the bread. And when you talk about Cuban sandwich, you've got to talk about the bread. These folks, young couple, Josh and Courtney Kress, Josh built his smokers at this place. Courtney is an RN, so you know it's clean. They had their bread shipped from La Segunda Bakery in Tampa, Florida, which opened in 1915. So that tells me a lot right there. You can see that bread. This is a Cuban at Hemingway's Cuba in Asheville, North Carolina. If you want a really good, fairly upscale Cuban meal, go there. It's on the 4th floor of the Cambria Hotel in Asheville. And you walk out, you can eat on the terrace. You walk out on that terrace, you get a great view of the Battery Park Hotel, where Thomas Wolfe stayed for a while in 1937, where F. Scott Fitzgerald stayed for a while, and you're looking right over the Grove Arcade. But they do a Cuban sandwich that's, you know, pretty close to the original. By the way, if you enjoy cocktails, that is the Hemingway daiquiri that you can have there. Ernest Hemingway, of course, lived in Cuba for a number of years and wrote there. This is based on his daiquiri recipe. He didn't like a sweet daiquiri, so this has got, in addition to lime juice, it's got grapefruit juice in it, and a maraschino cherry liqueur that's been made in Italy for about 200 years. All right, here's some dates. I'm a history major, throw some dates out. Citizens started leaving Cuba in the mid-1830s. Many of them located, of course, in Key West because it was 90 miles away. Constant struggle for independence from Spain. 10 years of inconsequential conflict did not gain Cuban independence from Spain. Cuba starts its own War of Independence in 1895, and then in 1898, the battleship Maine explodes. I'm not sure historians fully know what exactly happened, but that was a turning point, an excuse for the United States to go to war, try to get rid of Spain in the New World. That's what happened in 1898, the Spanish-American War, which of course ultimately catapulted Teddy Roosevelt to the presidency. The Secretary of State at the time of that war, John Hay, called it a splendid little war. It lasted all 4 months. And so, did Cuba gain its independence from Spain? Yes. But Cuba became a U.S. protectorate, not a territory. The territories that were created after that war were the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. So after that war, people flood into the United States. And the opposite happens. In the 20th century, in the middle of the 20th century, Cuba became a playground for the American rich. Specifically the mafia, who went wild in Cuba. Lavish parties that Frank Sinatra had were attended by the likes of people like JFK. Up until the 1950s, a lot of American wealth was pumped into Cuba. Of course, 53, Fidel Castro tries to take over, doesn't, launches a guerrilla war in 56. The president at the time was extremely corrupt, Fulgencio Batista. And in 59, Batista flees and Castro takes over. Up until 2021, of course, Fidel dies in 2016. His brother, Raul, ultimately takes over. Up until 2021, a member of the Castro family had been in charge of Cuba for 62 years. That grip, that vice grip on Cuba lasted 62 years, and it's still going on. I bet you 90% of the people in America could have told you who Castro was. I bet you 99% of the people in America can't tell you who the current president of Cuba is. I had to look it up. Miguel Diaz-Canel. I have to think about it. In '68, Castro shuts down all the privately owned restaurants. There are horrible stories under Castro about food rationing, food shortages. So with all that as background, let's talk about the sandwich. In that book again, it soon became apparent that socialism was incapable of producing a good Cuban sandwich or much else worth eating. The communist state never embraced the Cuban sandwich, which is probably another good reason for us to like it even more. Now, where did the sandwich come from? Food history is the hardest history to write. I guarantee you, I've tried it. Because so much of this stuff is never documented until a long time after it happens. Like recipes. Who invented fried chicken? You'll never know that. Who invented the dried apple stack cake? Some people say the Herod. It's in Kentucky. That's idiotic. That didn't happen. We won't know who invented the stack cake. Who invented the Cuban sandwich? Don't know that. But in 1900, you see the term in New York City describing something like our club. In 1903, a writer from South Carolina describes a sandwich he had in Cuba that sounds a whole lot like a Cuban, except it has turkey in it. And you see this turkey cropping up over and over in the history of the sandwich. The turkey, ultimately, the pavo, ultimately died away. In 1906, the Tampa Tribune mentions the Cuban sandwich by name. And in 1929, you begin to see Tampa claiming this sandwich as its own. Now, 3 places at least in Florida claim to own the Cuban. Key West claims it. Miami claims it. Tampa claims it. The thing about the linchpin here is salami. Because in the Tampa Cuban, you pretty much have to have salami. In the Miami Cuban, you don't. That to me is a function of the outmigration, and the fact that over the years, the sandwich had to be reduced in price. So, cut down on the number of meats. The Cuban sandwich industry, if you will, grew up in Tampa alongside cigar making. Cigar makers needed something quick, something that didn't require a knife and fork, they could hold in their hand. And so the history is concurrent. And that's Mr. Ybor, for whom Ybor City is named. He was a cigar maker in Cuba and then left and settled in Ybor City. This is fascinating to me. It's kind of a sidebar on the Cuban sandwich. In these cigar factories, and we were able to get into one in the 1980s that was still operating. Had the old guys there with their knives and their little pots of gum and their espresso, their coffee con leche, making cigars all day long. And what started out in the 1920s continued for many years, and that was the tradition of the lectores. The guy up on the pedestal there. These people who were rolling cigars all day long were read to. I find that fascinating. First of all, they were read newspapers produced by labor unions. And then after a while, they decided, we want to choose the material. So they picked the books and the types of reading matter. And there were men and women in those factories. And so you had lectores reading poetry, reading short stories, reading novels, and reading newspaper accounts as well. Now, Ybor City has always been a multicultural place. This is the Italian Club, the Unione Italiana, built in 1918, still there. This was like a mutual aid society. You could get insurance through them, you could play dominoes, you could get a drink, you could dance. go out on the curb, get a Cuban sandwich. There was an Italian-owned macaroni factory right there in Ybor City. And in 1909, a German-American club. And that has a direct bearing on the sandwich too. This place was vandalized in 1918. You know, what was ending in 1918 in World War I. We were fighting Germany. So that xenophobia translated to vandalism of the German-American club, and there were busts of German writers and musicians and heroes all through that building. They were thrown out into the street. And this is, I'll give you another term, the lonchero, the guy who made the sandwich. The guy who specially was to make that sandwich in a particular way. This shows you the multicultural nature of the Cuban sandwich. This is hanging on the wall in La Segunda Bakery in Ybor City. And it shows you the cultures that came together to make the sandwich. The Spanish, the Cuban, the Italian, the German, and I would add the American. The Columbia restaurant was opened 10 years before that bakery, 1905. When Duncan Hines did his glove compartment travel guide in the 1930s, he listed the Columbia restaurant. He also listed the Beaumont Inn in Harrodsburg, Kentucky in that book, and both of them are still around. 1905. We don't have a restaurant in this area near that old. That's 1905. But the Columbia has specialized in the Cuban sandwich done right. And this is their Cuban. Here's the architecture of the sandwich as described by the fourth generation owner, Richard Gonsmart. There are Columbia restaurants all over Florida now. That's the original. The Columbia is now in its fifth generation of ownership. The bottom half of the bread, you've got glazed baked ham. Theirs is from Wisconsin. On top of that, mojo pork. And that is pork marinated in citrus, or in some cases, brushed in citrus, usually lime juice. Sour orange was used in Cuba. That's how, this relates to barbecue, because the pork was barbecued after being marinated in something acidic. In Cuba, that was usually sour orange. Well, when that tradition moved into southeastern U.S., guess what? No orange trees. So that's how the vinegar came into North Carolina barbecue, the acidic element. The mojo pork. Then, very specific, 4 slices of Genoa salami with peppercorns. Has to be Italian. The Swiss cheese, of course, which is a Central European, German influence, and the pickles, a German influence. The top of the bread is coated with yellow mustard, slathered with butter, and then into a sandwich press, la plancha, for 8 minutes. Sandwich is sliced corner to corner, and that's important. Gonsmart, when he was retooling this Cuban to make it more authentic, tested over 12 varieties of mustard to put on that sandwich. This is what he settled on. So, yes, definitely an American story as well. Here's how Gonsmart says you should eat a Cuban. You start at the point. Don't start in the middle. Start at the point. Because if you eat in that direction, starting at the point, sandwich gets bigger. You feel like you've got more sandwich. This is the bread at La Segunda. Same bread people in Scott County are getting. What's that on top? It's a palmetto leaf, one of their traditions. The process is to put that strip on the loaf. And the owners of the bakery say it allows the loaf to split up, lets gas inside, making the bread airier. Steamed, proofed, placed in the ovens, and then baked on high heat. That palmetto strip also was an early thermometer, I think, telling them if the bread needed to be moved to a cooler part of the oven. At first called it pan de agua, water bread. But people ask me, what's the difference between Cuban bread and French bread? French baguette would not work with the sandwich. It's chewier. This bread, because of that process, has a very brittle crust. And that's why restaurants like Columbia buy these sort of, well, they're metal pieces, like flat shovels, and they shovel all the crumbs off the table. That's the final result. Of course, the pig. People think pigs are native to the New World. They are not. Pigs were brought into the Caribbean on Columbus's second voyage in 1493. And so Cubans have been barbecuing ever since. Curing ham, making lechon, which is like suckling pig, but because leche is milk, but it doesn't always have to be a suckling pig. And adding mojo to it. And that's a tostone there, but next to it is an example of mojo, that marinade, that garlicky, citrusy stuff. Some people think Cuban food is hot. Cubans don't eat a lot of hot food. They eat a lot of tart food. They eat a lot of garlicky food. Not hot peppers. And this is the pig roast in Kingsport. Whole hog, always whole hog, marinated in mojo. Go back to this slide. Exiles live by substitution. When Eduardo and his family were making this pork, initially they couldn't find sour orange. So they adapted, like Cubans have had to do their whole lives in America. And they adapted by using grapefruit juice and marinating the pig in the bathtub. And of course the salami. Now, how did this love of the sandwich get started? In Havana and other places, Cubans had the habit of walking a lot, typically late at night to avoid the tropical sun. So they began craving street food. And the Cuban sandwich is a great example of street food, as is the empanada, something you can hold in one hand. That one, by the way, those come from Hemingway's Cuba in Asheville. They're beautiful. And croquettes, again, handheld. Other names for the Cuban sandwich are the mixto, because there are several kinds of meat on it, the cubano, the medianoche, which means middle of the night, right? That craving as you're walking in the moonlight through Havana is fulfilled with the medianoche. There's another kind of Cuban sandwich I learned about, the frita cubana, fried sandwich, and they actually put shoestring potatoes on top of the meat. So the Primanti brothers in Pittsburgh were probably not the first people to put potatoes on hamburgers. Now, I'm gonna wrap up by talking about something I find fascinating. Where do you find Cuban sandwiches that are real and not far from here? Well, one area, strangely enough, is North Georgia. I love writing about incongruity, things that you might not expect. And we were doing a story years ago and needed an ethnic restaurant in North Georgia, and we were going to Helen. I thought, everybody writes about the German food in Helen, Georgia. Let's do something else. And I noticed an ad for Dan's Grill in Blairsville, Georgia. Doesn't sound like a Cuban place, but it's owned by Dan Hernandez. His family is very much Cuban, and the map of Cuba is on every table in that restaurant. Blairsville, Georgia, has a population of about 600 people. The whole county, Union County, has a population of 25,000. But there are 3 Cuban restaurants in Blairsville, Georgia. Not Mexican, Cuban, 3 of them. There's another one in nearby Blue Ridge. There's another one in nearby McKaysville. This is 90s in Blairsville, owned by Marife and Ray Arrascaeta. She is, as you can see by the flag above her head, Puerto Rican. He is Cuban. His father actually waited tables at the Columbia restaurant in Ybor City, Florida. And Lissy Herrera, Layla's Kitchen in Blairsville, another one. And this charming lady, Elizabeth Correa, who's known as the rum cake lady in North Georgia. You can buy her rum cakes over the internet. And there's her Cuban. She insists, no wimpy pickles. You gotta have pickles, but not wimpy ones. Charming lady. She has a place in Blue Ridge and one in McCaysville. And these are her parents. And that's their wedding picture, December 1953. Her father owned a restaurant in Cuba. And guess what? It was taken over by Castro. Her father rebelled, he was imprisoned, finally fled to Spain, then into New Jersey, and then back into Puerto Rico. So she is a child of that cruelty. Now, what's happening to the Cuban sandwich? In Cuba, a quote from the Havana Times, the menus at Cuba's state food industry establishments are a litany of super greasy processed cold meats, extremely salty minced meats, snacks fried in saturated oils that are several days old, soft drinks, and rancid sandwiches. Proof positive that communism does not work. I don't get political in these talks usually, but this is just so darn obvious. Tampa and Miami ultimately share the same heritage and face the same threat, and that's mediocrity, cutting corners. And we know why corners are cut, for economic reasons, to adapt, but still it's happening. The loncheros, I showed you the guy, are now replaced by electric deli slicing machines. The handmade hams and pork roasts that took so long to make are being replaced by industrial luncheon meats, which means any gas station or grocery store can sell a Cuban sandwich. The best is superseded by the cheapest. As you can see, this is more than just a sandwich. It's a story. It's history on a plate, which fascinates me. Adaptation, assimilation, independence, rebellion, memory, identity, and a symbol for displaced people, and a sad irony. Hughes, Cruz, and Houck say the Cuban sandwich conceived in Cuba and adopted by the United States truly belongs to the world now. All the world, it would seem, except for Cuba itself. And finally, I do think this is the most symbolic sandwich I've ever studied. Any questions?